Good afternoon. My name is John Herbst, and I'm the director of the Dinu-Putri Eurasia Center. And we've got a wonderful program for you today regarding the relationship between Turkey and Russia. Our speaker will be Congressman Gerry Connolly, who happens to be my congressman. He currently serves as the fourth term in Virginia's 11th district. His subcommittees and subcommittees include the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, and the Subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa. In addition, he serves as the co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on U.S.-Turkey relations and Turkish-Armenians in the Congressional Caucus on Korea, among others. I will not, you have his bio, I will not read more of it, and I'll ask Congressman Connolly to come to the stage. Please, thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Are you all dead? My God. We're talking about a serious subject here. I want to thank you, John, for that. And I want to thank the Atlanta Council for hosting us here today on the future of the Russo-Turkish relationship. I also want to thank my fellow panelists, Ambassador James Jeffrey, who comes from the same corner of the world I come from, or I should say Kana of the world, Boston. Dr. Soner Chegapte, Karun Demirjian, as well as our moderator, of course, John Herbst. To understand the complexity of this relationship and how dynamic the current situation has become, consider this. Within the span of just a few years, the Russo-Turkish relationship has gone from being characterized as one of the pillars of security and stability in Europe in 2013 to a potential source of Putin's next hybrid war, a more menacingly yet the potential source of Article 5 invocation. Our task today, it seems to me, is to explore, one, how the relationship has arrived at this point, two, the potential trajectories of those relations, and three, the U.S. and NATO's capability to and interest in shaping that relationship. On the first point, 21st century rapprochement has succumbed to the two nations' long history, divergent interests in several regional conflicts, and the Russian recklessness that resulted in the downing of the Russian Su-24 Fencer jet in November last year. Where we go from the century's nadir of Russo-Turkish relations will depend on the lessons President Putin learns from this period of tension with Turkey. If it turns out that the low-level harassment and subversion of Turkey and Turkish interests creates a convenient challenge for the U.S., NATO, and Europe without significantly impacting that relationship, Russia will have little incentive to change its tact. One way the U.S. and NATO can protect against this potentially threatening outcome is to strengthen its NATO ally and gateway to the Middle East by bolstering the Turkish institutions on which our shared values rest and helping Turkey resolve destabilizing domestic conflict democratically. This is not the Cold War. Not every interaction with Turkey is a zero-sum game. A return to the rapprochement that had preceded this period would not constitute a de facto loss necessarily for the U.S. or NATO. However, a rapprochement between Russia and Turkey based on their shared values, those of an authoritarian Russia and potentially an authoritarian Turkey, would be a considerable loss for both the U.S. and NATO. It would be easy to point to the more than 12 wars fought between the Russian and Ottoman empires between the 17th and 20th centuries to explain the current tension as just a reversion to the mean, which could be described as a deep and enduring enmity between two cultures that don't have a lot in common. Furthermore, one could cite the fact that several of those wars were in some way related to the Crimea Peninsula, and it would be tempting to draw a parallel between historical bilateral conflict and current tensions emanating from Russia's revanchist foreign policy laid bare by the forcible and illegal annexation of the Crimea in March of 2014. While this history of conflict constitutes an important historical context for the current tensions, it really doesn't adequately capture the complexity of modern-day Russian-Turkish relations. During the early part of the century, Turkey and Russia underwent somewhat of a rapprochement then. During this time, cooperation began on large infrastructure projects, including a $20 billion nuclear power plant and the natural gas pipeline Turk Stream. The energy relationship deepened to the point where Turkey was importing nearly 20% of all Russian natural gas exports by 2011. Turkey remains Russia's second largest energy customer in Europe and relies on Russia for 55% of its natural gas consumption. The two countries also began to encourage cultural exchanges. The Year of Turkey was observed by Russia in 2007 and the Year of Russia in Turkey in 2008. The number of tourists visiting Turkey reached 3.5 million before the current conflict, and Turkey previously, in reciprocation, had moved to allow visa-free travel by Turks to Russia. This period, however, was not without its own conflicts. Tensions continued to simmer over Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan, and the Russo-Georgian War in 2008 reminded Turkey of Russia's willingness to engage in military conflict in the Caucasus. Russia and Turkey's foreign policy goals most significantly diverged in Syria, where Russia doubled down on its support for the Assad regime. Syria, of course, has been sort of a client state of the Soviet Union and now Russia since Assad's father took hold of power in 1970. Syria is Russia's last remaining toehold in the Middle East and the site of strategic military installations, including the warm water port and naval base at Tartus. When the Assad regime began to experience sustained losses in the battlefield in 2015, Russia intervened again militarily with significant escalation, coordination, and support to back the Assad regime, and with some success. It was in this context of military escalation by Russia that on November 24th, a Turkish F-16 shot down a Russian Su-24 Fencer. Russia had already been warned on numerous occasions in which Russian jets violated Turkish airspace. And they were warned that would have consequences, including after a Russian jet locked its radar on the Turkish F-16 sent to intercept it. In the wake of that incident, the U.S. and NATO reaffirmed Turkey's right to defend its sovereign airspace. The U.S. also used the incident to point out that Russian sorties were routinely being carried out in close proximity to the Turkish border and were targeting the moderate opposition forces fighting Assad, not ISIL, allegedly our common foe. While some have labeled the Turkish response a reckless overreaction, I believe Turkey showed restraint in issuing several warnings leading up to the November incident and during a subsequent violation in January, and ultimately demonstrated to Russia that acts of aggression targeting the airspace of a NATO ally would have consequences. Where Russo-Turkish relations go from here will largely depend on how Vladimir Putin views the fallout benefiting or harming Russian interests. Rapprochement with Turkey was a tack Russia was willing to pursue until that policy was overtaken by Russia and Turkey's divergent foreign policy views. Russia's isolated sanctions against Turkey, the halt of talks on the Turkish Stream natural gas pipeline, newfound support for Kurdish interests, and growing military presence in Armenia just a few miles from the Turkish border constitute a policy of low-level subversion specifically targeted at getting Turkey's attention at the very least. However, Russia has not moved unilaterally to cut existing levels of natural gas supplied to Turkey, nor has it halted construction on the Akuyu nuclear power plant, what would be Turkey's first nuclear power plant. Indeed, much of the conflict is also personal in nature. We've got two strong man figures, Putin and President Erdogan of Turkey, who have made this conflict somewhat personal, which may lend itself to, at some point, a reconciliation between the two, because the fundamental differences may not go all that deep. We'll have to see. The U.S. and our NATO allies, including Turkey, have an immense responsibility to shape Russia's behavior in the region as best we can. Turkey is important. Turkey has been a strategically valuable NATO ally since 1952. It has the second largest standing army within NATO, 600,000 strong. It's home to Incirlik Air Base and has long served as NATO's gateway to the Middle East, a region currently the source of conflict and humanitarian crises that are now spilling over into Europe proper. And Turkey's done its fair share of accepting refugees, more than anybody else and at its own expense. The situation in which we find ourselves in an increasingly volatile part of the world, I think, necessitates a stable, strong, and democratic Turkey. While NATO has publicly called for de-escalation of tensions between Russia and Turkey, it would be damaging to long-term NATO interests if Russia is allowed to dictate the terms of that de-escalation and potential renewed rapprochement with Turkey. NATO allies must commit to helping resolve Turkey's conflict with the Kurds. Open fighting against the PKK in urban centers within Turkey has significantly eroded the security situation in parts of the country, and it is no secret that Turkey is highly threatened by U.S. cooperation with the YPG in Syria. Remember that Turkey's invocation of an Article 4 consultation last summer was not in response to a threat from Russia, but instead was ostensibly, in part, due to the growing strength of the Kurdish movement. During this moment of escalated tensions with Turkey, Russia has found the Kurdish issue to be a convenient way to instigate trouble for Turkish interests. Removing this point of Russian leverage and further aligning NATO and Turkish priorities would strengthen both Turkey and NATO and empower an ally on the ground in Syria that's having success in fighting ISIL. Again, Russo-Turkish relations are one factor in a complex conflict in the region. For Turkey, and Turkey must be enabled to engage Russia from a position of strength. For Turkey, this means facing an authoritarian Russia as a democratic NATO ally. Turkey has democratic and civil society institutions that must be enhanced. Recent crackdowns in Turkey against press freedoms and peaceful dissent are not only troubling, they actually destabilize the situation within Turkey. And they make it harder for NATO allies to stand with Turkey. Russia will absolutely exploit the democratic deficiencies of any country that is a NATO member, a military alliance with political mandate to promote democratic values. If doubt can be sown about an ally's commitment to that foundation, everything that flows from the alliance, including Article 5, is threatened. There's an oft-cited Turkish saying, the Turk has no friend but the Turk. A very kind of closed view of the world, unfortunately, and NATO should endeavor to prove this axiom wrong by helping a NATO ally de-escalate tensions in the region, and with Russia in particular, on NATO's shared terms, however. While Putin's Russia has leaned forward in world affairs, using revanchist policies and acts of subversion to maintain its sphere of influence, preventing conflict and strengthening allies is how NATO, the most powerful military alliance in the world, projects power. Reinforcing democratic values in Turkey is essential in this enterprise. Regardless of Russian actions, NATO must rededicate itself to its organizing principles in order to fortify Turkey internally and externally. We have no other choice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome, yes, please. I'd like to invite all the other panelists up to the stage. I'd like to remind you, we have AC hashtag. AC Russia is our hashtag for the event today.
We're fine.
Doing fine. That was
All
excellent.
right, good.
Hello. Well, you've been welcomed a few times, but I'm going to welcome everybody again now that we've moved on to the panel. My name is Karun Demirjian. I am very honored to be up on this stage with four distinguished panelists. You heard Congressman Gerry Connolly speak. I don't know that actually I was in the room when you had your introduction, but he is one of the co-chairs of the Congressional Caucus on U.S.-Turkey Relations. Sitting to my immediate left is Ambassador James Jeffrey. He served, his previous positions include everything from being ambassador to Iraq as well as Turkey, and also served as the assistant to the president and deputy national security advisor during the Bush administration. Moving on down the line, you heard already from Ambassador John Herbst, who has served in Uzbekistan, a country I always wanted to go to when I was based in Moscow but never made it, and Ukraine, and has been a career foreign service officer as well. And then at the end of the stage is Dr. Soner Chaptai. People with difficult to pronounce names have to look out for each other. He is the Bayer Family Fellow and the Director of Turkish Research at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and is a familiar face and name as speaking as an expert on these affairs, and also author of several articles and books on the subject. My name, like I said, is Karun Demirjian. I am a reporter for the Washington Post. I currently cover defense and foreign policy, primarily with a focus on Capitol Hill. And prior to this position, which I started last summer, I was a Moscow correspondent based in Russia covering the former Soviet Union. So I am really excited that we're actually discussing Russo-Turkish relations at this point, not only because it's been a very peppery subject, as you heard from Congressman Connolly, some of the developments that have caused the world to kind of sit at the edge of their seat and wonder what's going to happen, but just because, you know, as a scholar of history back in the day before I became a journalist, and as somebody who likes to look for, you know, the background to all these reasons, I have always been struck by how these two countries, how similar they are in many ways. I'm going to overgeneralize just for my 1 minute little opener, that they are often so similarly situated in terms of the types of people they have as their leaders and the types of social experiences they're having at similar points in history, and yet often end up being at each other's throats. And you know, it's like you said, it's important not to try to ground everything that's happening in just a lens that's too historically focused. But you know, the history of the Russian-Turkish relationship does have the experience in the 19th century and before of a lot of conflict. And as these two regional power centers basically vied for who was going to be in control of the land that was in between them, as things have changed historically, they've gone through periods where they've been trying to build their relationship. After World War I, before there was distrust that grew up in World War II, and then they ended up on different sides of the Cold War when the Cold War ended. And then you saw a development of Russian-Turkish relations that, when I was based in Russia, you know, it started off being a very happy period in that you have Turkey buying more of Russia's natural gas than most other countries, any place in the West, that you have Turkey being the #1 destination for Russians who are sick of the cold during the winter and they want to go vacation there, so that the economic ties were incredibly, incredibly strong. And as you also said, Congressman, you know, two leaders who kind of understand each other, that in the way they're both strong men who kind of want to build their countries again in a way that, you know, maybe is a little sympathetic to the whole pre-20th century empire idea of wanting to, you know, being a little bit afraid of opposition inside the country, a little bit pro-crackdown, kind of wielding these religious themes again as tools of state control. And then you've got the question of, you know, were these 17 seconds something that's going to change the world, or is this something that they can get over as one of the various phases? So I guess as the first question I'd like to put to anybody who wants to jump in is how important do you think, how pivotal do you think the most recent period of Russian-Turkish strife is, that is based around Syria, which clearly has become an epicenter, right? And also, how pivotal is it, and also how important is it that Russia and Turkey have a close alliance and are able to get over this and develop some sort of a friendship out of it?
Let me start. Thank you very much, Corinne, and John and Atlantic Council for having us here today, because this is an important subject. It's a very interesting one, and you put the point on it with that question, because almost everything we talk in this place, this house, and most other places around Washington focuses on two things. what some country is doing wrong internally and how America should or could fix it, and it's all about us, America. This is a subject that doesn't really, while we'll talk a lot about the internal situation, I'm sure, and a lot about what America should do about everything. This is primarily not about either subject. It's about something that is rearing its perhaps ugly head again called geopolitics. And so I want to spend a minute to answer that from the standpoint of geopolitics, because it's fascinating. We really haven't had geopolitics since the end of the Cold War, and even then it tended to be bilateral geopolitics, with a little bit of China breaking out of the East and France occasionally pretending to break out of the West. It was all about us versus the other side. Now we're back in the kind of geopolitical realm that we had in the 19th century. And we all know how the 19th century wound up into 1914, which is why there's some concern about situations like this. In such a situation, the first question is, who is out to essentially secure, maintain, or represent the global status quo, and who is out to shake it? Initially, the answer would be Putin's Russia is out to shake up the global status quo and order, and Turkey, as a NATO state, is defending it. But to some degree, and Sona Chaptai knows far more about this than I, Turkey's adventures in the Middle East over the last decade have been, in its own way, a deviation from the status quo that we've expected from Europe, from Japan, Korea, and Turkey. Essentially a effort that has largely failed to shape the region in now President Erdogan's image as a place where Muslim brother Sunni political Islam groups are dominant. Long before Russia got into Syria, that dream was basically in the ash can of history. But Syria was a different case, because with Syria it's both personal and it was also geostrategic with this alliance between Iran and Syria. Now, with Russia joining it, this is both, again, very personal between Erdogan and Assad, but also a very serious threat to Turkey. And it has to be fixed because, as the Congressman said, we as Turkey's allies, and this isn't just a off-the-cuff alliance, it is at the very core, because it's part of NATO, of our entire role in the world, we have to support Turkey. But that means we have to work a lot harder to figure out where we and Turkey can agree on Syria, and that requires changes on both sides, not just Turkey's, or this thing is not going to go in a good direction. Thank you.
I'm glad that Jim introduced geopolitics, because we are in a new age, or a new old age of geopolitics, precisely because the Kremlin is a revisionist power. The amazing thing, though, is how Mr. Putin, to get a cheap shot at NATO, destroyed the relationship with Turkey that he'd built so carefully and to his advantage. I mean, traditionally, Turkey and Russia, going back to the Ottoman days, or for that matter, the Cold War, were standing on opposite sides of whatever line was drawn. But since early 2000, Putin cultivated the Turks with some success. When he went into Syria, his decision to go into Turkish airspace repeatedly, and I agree with Congressman Connolly that the Turks showed restraint. They only shot down the Russian airplane on the 4th incursion. They did that in order to demonstrate that they could get away with it. Putin was going after not so much Turkey, but NATO. But he was willing to damage his relationship with the country he had courted assiduously. And so he was astonished when the Turks shot down his plane, because that was the strongest step that anyone in the West has taken against his aggression, whether in Georgia or whether in Ukraine or whether in Syria. And, you know, if you look carefully at what happened on the day of the shootdown, the Russian spokesman, Kremlin spokesman Peskov, and the Russian defense minister Shoigu both denied that the Turks shot him down. They said, oh, there was a Turkmen. Only when the government of Turkey said, yes, we did it, then they accepted it. And then, as a matter of face, they decided to go after the Turks.
Can I say, John?
Please.
I also wanted to pick up where Jim left, and I want to thank you, John, and the Atlantic Council for putting together this very timely and important debate. I think when you look at it from the historical perspective, what is an anomaly is not the hostile relationship, but it's the 20-year period before that that was about cordial and mostly good ties. Turkey and Russia have been neighbors now for almost 550 years. They became neighbors in 1470s when the Crimean Khanate joined the Ottoman Empire as a commonwealth. So when Putin annexed Crimea, actually, and saying that it was Russian, I wanted to call him and say it's really Tatar. So if you want to go back to history. But anyhow, the empires became neighbors, and from then on, 1470s, until pretty much the recent times, the relationship was characterized by much hostility, much of it coming from Russia. Many of these wars launched by Russia, lost by the Ottomans, nevertheless. And I think the last 20 years, starting with the end of communism, but really with ceasefire in Nagorno-Karabakh, mid-1990s, until this very last year, so 20-year period, was an incredibly unusual episode in Turkish-Russian relations. Good ties, both commercial and political, driven by leaders, Putin and Erdogan, and by an extension of that, deep energy relations and deep commercial ties and personal relations. Of course, Russians are now number one among all nationalities who visit Turkey. There's a very deep personal relationship as well. And I think that was very unusual. That came to an end. So maybe the relationship is back to its, to use Jim's term, original geostrategic calculations as both sides see it. I should caveat myself, there was one more period of good ties in the relationship in the 1920s when Turkey was coming out of World War I. Ataturk was leading an independence campaign. Then, of course, Soviet Union, led by Lenin, helped Turkey, provided Turkey with weapons that Turkey used against Greece. And this is because Lenin thought that Turkey's struggle was an anti-imperialist struggle. He wanted to help it. Ataturk was smart. He took Russian assistance, defeated the Greeks. He turned against the Russians, shut down the Communist Party, and the relationship was therefore short-lived. So with those two episodes aside, this is really a deeply hostile relationship historically driven by geostrategic concerns.
Does it behoove, just taking a very US-centric position, right? Does it behoove the United States to just kind of accept that and go forward, or is it actually better for the rest of the world if Russia and Turkey try to build on these anomalous periods, right? And go ahead? Because we've discussed, who's at fault, and we've discussed, why these things contributed to each other, but is it okay, is it better to just accept the way things are, that they don't work well together, and deal with things going forward, or does that just contribute to more instability? And is there a way to bring any sort of longevity to those better periods, or is that just, we shouldn't be going that direction because it's a false hope?
Well, I think the answer to that is it depends. It depends on the evolution both in Russia and Turkey. And for that matter, the evolution of NATO and our role in it. I mean, we've invested over 60 years in this relationship as a NATO anchor, and Turkey has something going for it that won't ever change. It is strategically straddling, two continents and is in the most dangerous neighborhood in the world, arguably. And we need a stable Turkey. We want, and I think need, a democratic Turkey. Frankly, Russia may want that too. Maybe not so much the democratic part, but the stable part. The last thing in the world Russia needs. I mean, Putin's playing around because he's angry at Erdogan. He was humiliated by the shoot-down. Their interests are clashing in Syria. But I don't think he wants to get carried away. And if you actually were to succeed in destabilizing Turkey, and you had another Syria on your hands, that would be an enormous challenge for Russia. They've got their own internal problems. The last thing in the world they want is something like that so close by. So playing around, reminding Erdogan that they can cause mischief, certainly pursuing their own interests, and sometimes those clash with Turkey in the region, that's one thing. But whether you really want to make this implacable hostility for some length of time in a neighborhood you both kind of share, I have my doubts. I think in the long term, both of them need to work out some kind of modus vivendi, and that may or may not be in our interest.
To pick up on the Congressman's, it depends. Again, you have to look at what kind of a conflict this is. If it's typical of, say, or analogous to, say, Greece and Turkey, and believe me, they've had planes go down over the Aegean, or to move it away from Turkey, Pakistan, and India over Kashmir, then you can say, you know, the usual American, I can push the buttons in my sleep, as can John from our time in government. You know, we fly in the special negotiator. We have a laundry list of things to get the two sides together because we want people to just be nice to each other. If, however, there is real elements of geostrategic issues here, then the degree to which we want one of our allies to cut a deal with the other side, there are limits to it. We were happy that Germany had good relations with Russia during the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but at certain points, Ostpolitik got a bit worrisome. If Turkey decides Russia's on the march, nobody, i.e. the United States, is going to stop it, and we got to cut the best possible deal, and Putin's the guy to do it with, then you got a real problem.
Yeah.
Look, just to weigh in, I think the plane incident, though it was an unpleasant one, it was not the problem per se. I think it was a symptom of the problem that Turkey and Russia were on collision course in their Syria policy, supporting different sides in a civil war, therefore engaged in a proxy war for the first time since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, one could say. And I think in this regard, it was the plane incident, in my view, was bound to happen. If not the plane, something else would have happened that would have put Russia and Turkey at odds militarily. So the question is, can they move forward and establish a relationship again? It all depends on how things turn out in Syria, because that's where the main conflict is between the two countries. I think Russia's game in Syria is to not only build the Assad regime and boost his military presence, but also establish stalemate in the civil war, so that both sides in the war will be forced to come to the peace table, similar to Bosnia in mid-1990s, when there was civil war. First the Serbs pushed the Bosnians back, then the Bosnians pushed the Serbs back, and then there was stalemate on the battlefront. Both sides realized that they could not win anymore by fighting, came to détente. I think that's Russia's game. Russia knows that Assad will probably not be able to get 100% of Syria back, but they want him to get back enough and create a stalemate on the ground that he'll force the other side to come to the table. I don't think Turkey is ready to agree to that stalemate, which would include continuation of the Assad regime over large parts of the country, just as because Turkey's policy has been singularly aimed at ousting Assad. So when Turkey comes to that conclusion, I think then you can establish a modus vivendi between Turkey and Russia. Of course, that also assumes that Russia is successful in promoting its allies, so that they have won the upper hand in the battlefront, and they're not losing, but they're also not winning tremendously.
Since we're on the topic of Syria and the Middle East in general, what logical role is there for each of these countries to play in the Middle East as things move forward? Clearly, both have tried to maintain some sort of control, maintain some sort of influence over the way politics has progressed in the region, and you could make arguments that neither's been that successful over the last maybe 5 or 6 years, most recently since the Arab Spring started. But where do you think logically it should shake out that these countries have a role in the Middle East, if at all? Since that seems to be the place where heads are knocking.
Again, I'll just continue. I think if the big problem for Turkey-Russian relationship from the Turkish side is whether Turkey come to an understanding of agreeing to Assad's regime's continuation in Syria and therefore reaching a modus vivendi with Russia, the big problem for Russia for restoring Turkish-Russian ties is whether Russia can come to terms with the rise of Sunni Islam in the Middle East. I think Russia's biggest fear is political Sunni Islam, radical or not. And that's primarily driven by Russian domestic considerations. Russia, as we know, is 15-20% Muslim, and Russia's Muslims are almost exclusively Sunni. So I think Russia always fears, because of domestic concerns, Sunni Muslim radicalism. It has no problems whatsoever with Shiites. It doesn't see them as Shiites because it's not a concern for Russia, and I think, therefore, hence its alliance with Iran and other regional powers. So the question is for the two powers to play a role in the region that they won't feel at odds with each other, whether Russia will feel comfortable with Turkey's role in the Syrian civil war and the broader Middle East, and to what extent Turkey will feel comfortable with Russia's alignment with Iran and other Shiite powers. So I think there's also an undeniable sectarian leitmotif, which is unusual because Russia is not a Muslim country, because of its domestic politics that we have to take into account.
Although they love to say that they're the biggest Muslim country in Europe, right?
Yeah.
So, yes.
In Soviet days, or rather in the post-World War II period, the Soviet Union played a major role in the Middle East, starting with the arms sales to Nasser in '55. Under Putin, Russia has returned to the Middle East, but it's returned to the Middle East not on the offensive, but to shore up its one long-term ally,
Syria.
Assad. That's right. The Kremlin problem is that their military intervention was able to stabilize Assad's position and allow him to take territory on the road to Aleppo. But it's not able to do much more than that, and the Russians have at least partly withdrawn before facing the hard reality that, in fact, the various Sunni groups, largely extremist, are stronger on the battlefield than even a Russia-backed Assad. It may be that Russia understands that, which is why Putin has pulled back, but it's not certain. At the moment, he still seems to be winning. His secondary objective in the Middle East has been to strengthen his role more broadly, capitalizing on the deep unhappiness with the United States for its unwillingness to engage in Syria. And he's had some success with that too. Even though the policies he's pursuing are policies that the Saudis and the other Gulf states do not like. I agree partly that some modus vivendi in Syria could lead to an improvement in Turkish-Russian relations, but I suspect that Syria will gobble up the interests of both Turkey and Russia before that can happen.
Yes.
I was going to disagree with John, but then he gave the second motive for Putin going in, and I said, no, John and I are, again, aligned. I distinguish between geopolitics and realpolitik. Realpolitik is pursuing your cold-blooded interests, trade, military, diplomatic, in the world without worrying too much about domestic considerations in the target countries and higher values. Geopolitics is all about sort of winning and dominant positions. With Putin, I think it's a mix of both. As John said, he did go in initially for defensive purposes. That's classic realpolitik, and there people can cut deals. I think that's where the President of the United States' mind currently is. Thus, he thinks that a deal can be cut with Russia, and possibly it will. The problem is, as John said, there's also geopolitical interest there, not just to establish his role in the Middle East, but because he sees an opportunity to squeeze the United States and its allies. There's a real reason why Putin had his troops in Syria and flying missions. That relates to realpolitik, but repeatedly sending his fighter planes, and in this world, believe me, ground controllers know exactly where the planes always are, into not just Turkish territory, but Turkish territory that was part of Syria until the end of the 1930s and is still claimed as part of Syria, was a geopolitical chess move to squeeze Turkey as part of this larger thing. And it's very hard to reconcile competing interests when you're at that level. When you're down at realpolitik, where there's a minimum Russian need, a minimum American need, a minimum Turkish need, you can possibly work something out. And that's where all the tension is right now.
Well, you know, there are lots of ways of looking at this. And my old professor from Harvard, Tom Schelling, would probably have a lot of fun with game theory on what's going on in this relationship. But the Russians can be, Putin can be seemingly reckless and yet stabilizing at the same time. So while they're, from our point of view, certainly recklessly engaged in the Ukraine and Crimea and Syria, on the other hand, you could look at some of their behavior as relations as normal. So we cooperate in the space station, we cooperate on climate change. The Russians were very critical to the JCPOA and the Iran nuclear agreement. So they're not implacably reckless. They are pursuing their own interests, and they are always probing how far they can get with us historically. And Turkey is a piece on that chessboard from their point of view. But I just one final point. I always thought this fear that you talked about the radicalization of Sunni Islam is very palpable in Russia, maybe more than we fully appreciate. It was certainly on their minds in the Soviet days, and I believe was a factor in the Afghan invasion. They are terrified of that phenomenon and infecting Russia, Mother Russia itself. And that's another constraint on them with respect to Turkey. They cannot afford that to happen widespread in Turkey. And therefore, that's a natural constraint on what they can and will do in their relations with
I can
Turkey.
also add that I think Russia is not only a global power wannabe that's trying to shape Middle East politics, but through the extension of its domestic politics, it's also a Middle Eastern power, because it now sees itself as part of the sectarian division that's splitting and emerging in the region, and it's seeing its interest as aligned with the Shiite side of that split, because it has zero concerns about Shiite radicalism. It doesn't really care that they could be good or bad. Yeah.
Well, there are very few Shiites in Russia compared to, Chechnya. You've made my transition for me. The one question I wanted to ask before I turned it to the audience was, we're talking about geopolitics, we're talking about realpolitik. We hadn't talked that much about how the domestic politics are really to the extent that domestic politics are driving what these leaders are making decisions, how they're choosing to engage abroad. We just discussed a little bit about why Putin wants to have a foothold in the Middle East. Clearly, there's also been quite a lot of discussion about what Turkey's doing vis-a-vis the Kurds and their concerns about Kurds in the Middle East as well. But broader also, I'm just taking a look at what the trends are right now domestically and how both of these leaders stay in power. I was wondering if you would comment on that for both countries, really, and how that's dictating actions.
I'll start maybe with, two things that worry me about our relations with Turkey. One is that I think President Erdogan has almost single-handedly managed to persuade a large chunk of public opinion here in America that pays attention, that he is on an anti-democratic, authoritarian path that makes us very uncomfortable and calls into question whether Turkey can be sincere in its hopes for accession to the EU. And that is a very alarming trend that concerns us. And he'll say some things that are reassuring, and then there'll be some behavior that calls into a question. I don't know that his visit to Washington recently covered itself in glory, in reassuring the press or the public or the cognoscenti here that he was on a sincere democratic path we can be comfortable with. Secondly, we're going to have to work real hard in the relationship to avoid a collision on the Kurds. In my opinion, it is in U.S. interest to support the YPG in Syria and to support the Peshmerga in Iraq. They fight. They are the only ones so far with serious battlefield success against the common enemy, ISIS. And Turkey, has lots of concerns about Kurds in general and the YPG and the Peshmerga in particular. And I'm afraid that is, our interests do not coincide in those two battlefronts, and we're going to have to work that out. It could get worse, or we might be able to contain it, but that's an open question mark, and a very important one, because the United States is committed and is not going to back down in its fight against ISIS.
On Russia and Syria and domestic politics in Russia, Syria thus far has been a real success for Mr. Putin at home. When he decided to go in September, Russia was bogged down, as they remain bogged down, in the east of Ukraine. He was having trouble managing that. And up until that point, Ukraine had dominated the Russian media. When he went into Syria, suddenly Syria dominated the Russian media. As of the quote-unquote pullout of a month ago, it looks like a Russian success, a Putin success, and that has bolstered his credentials as a great power leader at home in Russia. In the long run, that could change, but at the moment, it looks like a positive for him.
Just to continue, I think Putin is a revivalist leader in the sense that after the horrible Yeltsin years, he wants to give the Russians a sense of being a superpower again. And as John said, hence the appeal of his Syria policy. And I think this is how many Russians view the plane incident, meaning they broadly support Putin's policies and they support any punishment towards Turkey, because they think that by shooting down the plane, Turkey not just shut down a plane, but also shut down Russia's lofty ambitions to return to global power as a global player, Middle East player. So it's symbolic in that regard also for the Russian audience, who are seeing this as a shot at Putin's revivalism, which most people adore and support. On the Turkish side, though, I think this is very interesting. I've been following the debate. I think Russia, Putin specifically, has been very adept in addressing the divisions of Turkish society. Turkey, as we know, is very polarized between supporters and opponents of the governing Justice and Development Party, AKP. There were a lot of allegations after the plane incident. I think the incident really changed a significant amount of policy in Turkey and foreign politics. I'm going to make up a term now. I'm going to call it API after the plane incident. Turkey is different than BPI before the plane incident. So API, one of the things that changed is Putin's allegations about Turkey became not about Turkey suddenly, but about Erdogan. So suddenly you heard allegations that Erdogan's son was involved in illegal oil smuggling with ISIS. It was all about Erdogan's family, Erdogan doing this, Erdogan doing that. He's never said Ankara or Turkey. I think it's very personal. Yeah. He knows that when he does this, half of Turkey, he hopes, will embrace his arguments because of Turkey's political divisions for Erdogan. Yeah. And I think this is Russia's game. As the congressman pointed out, Russia will try to exploit Turkey's democratic weaknesses and polarization, which has to stop if you don't want Turkey to be obviously prone to Russian games.
Okay. That's an important point I'd like to carry a little bit further. Absent the kind of bogging down that John mentioned in eastern Ukraine, in general, the Russian population, or most of it, seems to be very happy with Putin's, we're back on the international scene, we're now throwing our weight around policies. That's not the same with Erdogan's, as I said, his geostrategic phase when he tried to reshape the Middle East. And specifically Syria, up to the present, there hasn't been a whole lot of domestic support, including from people who normally will vote for him for that kind of thing. The Turks are not expansionistic, and the military, above all else, is not expansionistic. On the other hand, the blowback from things going wrong, particularly with Russia and particularly in Syria, as we've just heard, be it the PKK insurgency, be it the ISIS strikes inside Turkey, be it the impact of various things Putin can do to the economy, be it tourism, be it energy eventually. These all do echo in the domestic situation. So Erdogan's room for maneuver, I think, is less than his bravado would indicate.
I think this is probably a good moment to turn it over to the audience. If anybody has questions, probably the best thing to do is just, if you can get up, say who you are, where you're from, and state your question as pithily as possible. We can start with the gentleman in the glasses, yeah. Oh, and there are mics around on the sides.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm George Delishvili, visiting scholar at Georgetown University. So my question is about two periods of the rapprochement and the cordial relationship between Turkey and Russia. So it was like mentioned very aptly that they both coincide with the periods where the relations with the West is strained. For instance, like the 20 years of relatively good relations were dominated by the common animus towards the West for different reasons. And this like this honeymoon in the 20s was because kind of this had a common enemy. So do you think that some lessons could be drawn about this like in the future? And the second related question, because of this Turkish both political and economic and like Russian sanctions and aggravated situation, today I think that there is a situation whereby Turkey needs the West much more than the West needs Turkey. And there is an opportunity, window of opportunity to improve Turkey domestically, to make it really Western state politically, domestically, not only internationally. So do you really believe there is a window of opportunity, and has the West using it? I believe kind of this deal with EU and Turkey is not the step in the right direction, in my opinion. Thank you.
I'll take a crack at it. I mean, I happen to believe that it's in our interest, the West's interest and U.S. interest, and especially Europe's interest, that we have a stable, integrated, democratic Turkey. And it's vitally important on lots of levels, not least of which is, can we take the Ataturk model of a secular, well, hopefully democracy eventually, that is a Muslim majority, and allow it to at least be a benchmark, if not a model, for other aspiring Muslim democracies. Now, that's not a trivial issue from the U.S. point of view or the West point of view. But its strategic location, even putting that aside, is just critical. Now, that's why I think it's in U.S. interest to prod the Europeans to be more receptive to Turkey's ultimate accession. The more you persuade Turkey, no matter what we do, we're never going to be accepted in that club, period. the alienation allows for anti-democratic tendencies and policies to flourish, and that's not in our interest. So, I'm not quixotic about EU accession, but the U.S. could and should do more to, I think, enter into dialogue with our European friends about that. Has to be seriously on the table if we're going to moderate behavior by Erdogan, and if we're going to anchor that part of the world with Turkey in its strategic location.
Dr. Schatz, how would you
Quickly
gauge the
on this
health
question,
of it
look,
right
I think
now?
these two episodes of warm relations I described are not necessarily similar when you look at Turkey's ties to the West during those episodes. Maybe, yes, in the 20s, during the Turkish War of Independence, Turkey's ties to the West were strained, and maybe that's a characteristic of it. And I think when Lenin extended military assistance to Ataturk's campaign, he thought that he could then co-opt Turkey into an anti-imperialist camp. Ataturk opened up a communist party when Lenin sent in assistance, but shut it down as fast as he could after he defeated the Greeks and established a modern republican Turkey. In the 1990s, I think the relationship was different. Turkey's ties to West were very good. Ties to US and NATO were in excellent shape, better than they had been, with strong cooperation in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Macedonia. And I think this is, despite that Turkish-Russian relations took off, really aided by deeper commercial ties and this rapport between the two leaders, Erdogan and Putin. That's why I think that rapport is an interesting one, because that has probably broken down, in my view. It's going to be hard to fix that. As I said earlier, when Putin decided to go after Erdogan, he decided to air out groundless allegations about him and his family rather than targeting Turkey policy, knowing that the society is so polarized in Turkey that the anti-Erdogan camp is going to embrace at least some of these arguments, which is in fact what happened. So I think Turkey will be stronger against Russia if it addresses its domestic polarization, which always provides Russia with a playing area. Finally, on the EU front, I think ironically, Russia might be helping in this regard, actually, in this opening of Turkish-EU relations by driving the refugee crisis. So we think that most refugees from Syria come from ISIS, because ISIS is the most horrific, disgusting organization, and it does horrible things. Most people who leave Syria are coming from regime-controlled areas or areas bombed by the regime or by Russia. So there's a direct correlation between Russian military intervention and refugee flows. And refugee flow is the issue that is now bringing Turkey and EU together. It is the new basis of this transactional Turkish-EU relationship. So ironically, I think by driving refugee flows, Putin has actually jump-started Turkish-EU relationship once again, breathed some life back into it.
It's interesting that you say it's transactional. I mean, the health of the Turkey and the West. Yeah.
There's one more point that I think needs to be addressed. We can improve both U.S.-Russian relations, U.S.-Turkish relations, and relations within NATO, including Turkey, with a stronger support for Turkey in the wake of the shoot-down of the Russian plane. NATO's support for Turkey was halting and slow when it happened. And the same is true for the United States support. It should have been immediate, and it should have been we stand with our NATO ally as a result of that incursion, and that did not happen.
I just have a jump-off question, just because you raised the refugees issue in that deal. Most of the coverage that came out of that period of negotiating that deal seemed like it was not a very healthy dynamic between Turkey and the EU and in trying to make that deal. But you were saying that you think it'll actually improve relations. I was wondering if you could expand on that point and if others agree with that.
Obviously, yeah. Go ahead, Jim.
I'll jump in quickly. The problem with an issue like refugees is, in this town or any place else, if the subject comes up, you're going to turn to a refugee expert. A refugee expert, most of the time, is going to have a very UNHCR idealistic view of how you deal with refugees, and it is a very liberal, very broad, very rights-based approach. And it is the currency of the realm when we talk about refugees here in Brussels, at the UN, and most other places. It doesn't reflect often the realities on the ground. This deal actually can help. I'm watching it when I was just in Germany last week, can actually help the situation in Europe, and it can help Russia. It is violating at least the letter and certainly the spirit of all kinds of UN and EU strictures and statements and policies on refugees. There's no doubt about it, but it may work.
I think Turkey hasn't actually signed half of those
Exactly,
though, right? So, yes.
Yeah, I think one of the untold stories in Washington is this relationship between Russian bombing and the refugee flows It was not an accident that the number of refugees leaving Syria and trying to move into Europe increased last year in leaps and bounds as Russian military arrived and started bombing rebel-held areas. Before the Russians came, the Syrian regime, its planes were capable of bombing only during the day and when the weather was nice. So if it was nighttime, snowed, fog, rain, you were safe if you lived in a rebel-held territory. When the Russians came, it's 24/7. They bomb day and night, bad weather and nice weather. So people don't take chances anymore. I think the idea that you could live and hope to be safe in rebel-held areas is now a fantasy. And there is therefore a direct relationship between this Russian bombing and refugee flows. What it has done, as I said, is this transactional relationship between Turkey and the EU, so that both sides are now working to control refugee flows. And that is transactional in my view. And as Jim said, if you take comment from the UNHCR perspective, there's a lot of problematic issues going on. But at the same time, the deal also opens Turkey's accession talks once again. And I think in the long term, EU accession is the only remaining anchor of democratic consolidation in Turkey. So it's good that that anchor is back. Yeah.
I agree.
Next question. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Rafi Danziger, an advisor to AIPAC.
I can't hear you.
I'm Rafi Danziger, an advisor to AIPAC. And my question is as follows. Russia is not the only country on the other side of Turkey and Syria. The other one, of course, is Iran. And yet it seems that Turkey and Iran have been able to kind of compartmentalize the issue of Syria and maintain very normal relations between them. Why can't Russia and Turkey do the same thing? That, okay, so we disagree on Iran, we're on the other side, but still it's in our interest to maintain normal relations the way that Iran and Turkey have been able to do. Thank you.
The key problem here is that Turkey is a member of NATO. And Putin just could not keep himself from going into Turkish airspace during the Syrian campaign. And the Turks were not going to let that happen several times without taking the response they did. And that just completely shattered the relationship that was developed between Erdogan and Putin, as described already here. So it's going to take a lot of time for the type of logic you just described to play, if it plays at all.
I think it's also important. Let's look at this in a broader context of the Russian probing and testing of NATO itself. So it isn't just Turkish airspace, is it? It's the illegal annexation of Crimea and what's our reaction to it. It is the constant probing and testing of the Baltic republics and what will we do by way of response. It is probing on the Polish border. And so this is sort of a broader testing. And I think one of the salutary effects of the shoot-down, whether intended or not, was to remind Putin that there is some muscle behind NATO. It may take a while to flex it, but it's there. And you need to be reminded of that. And what was the reaction after that happened? Much more cautious, more pullback, sort of a Pavlovian reaction, if you will, to the shoot-down. So I think it had a salutary effect. It doesn't solve everything, but there are limits to NATO's tolerance, and that shoot-down reminded him of that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because I'll contrast Turkey and Iran with Saudi Arabia and Iran. For Turkey and Iran, Syrian policy and Iran generally, its behavior in the region, is a classic realpolitik conflict of interest. Neither country really thinks they can seriously push the other one out of the region or push the other one down into a vassal status. Between the Saudis and the Iranians, because of the religious element, which for some reason doesn't play out the same way in Sunni Turkish Turkey the way it does in Saudi Arabia, that's more of a geostrategic battle, existence battle. You don't have that between Turkey and Iran. You just have essentially a conflict of interest. With Russia and Turkey, however, the Turks sense, and I think, as the Congressman said correctly, that Russia is out to fundamentally change the order of things in the Middle East. If the Turks felt that the Iranians were doing that, and in particular, if they feel that this budding relationship between Iran and Russia expands, and the next thing to watch is, do they go out after ISIS together? Then I think Turkey will have a different attitude towards Iran.
I think that the plane incident and what happened afterwards has, I agree with the congressman, has really reminded NATO of its significance in this part of the world. And Russian violation of Turkish airspace, I agree with the congressman, was part of this broader pattern of Russian violation of many other allied nations' airspace that had been going on for a long time, from the Nordics all the way to the Black Sea. So, but I think what that does for Turkey's NATO relationship with NATO is that it's actually really good news. So before the plane incident, BPI, the Turkey's ties to NATO were strong, important, but increasingly Turkey had this sense that it could act on its own as a standalone power in the Middle East, and it didn't really need NATO that much. I think the plane incident reminded to Turkey that it really needed NATO that much. If after the plane incident, Putin did not treat Turkey the way he treated Ukraine and Georgia with outright aggression, if one reason for that is because Turkey has a very large, powerful military, the other reason is that Turkey is in NATO. And I think that's really increased NATO's value in Turkey, and it will keep NATO's value very high in Turkey. And by extension, of course, it's good news for Turkish-US relationship because it increases the value of United States to Turkey as an ally. I think this was a reminder to Turkey that its historic nemesis, Russia, is back. The nemesis that it fought for 470 years against, and except for this 20-year period, it's back. It's back with its typical foreign policy toolbox of doing all sorts of unconventional things in Turkey's neighborhood. And I think, therefore, it really increases the value of the relationship, but also breathes significant new life into Turkish-NATO ties.
You know, I have to say, I was struck by the ambassador's observation, which I hadn't thought about that Iran-Turkey relationship. Iran causes a lot of mischief in a lot of neighborhoods. It has a very large border with Turkey. In fact, it uses Turkey, I think, for ventilation. Millions of Iranians come into Turkey every year, and I don't think they require a visa, do they?
No. And they go to the beach. So.
And they go to the beach, and they do things that great Satan would like to do. Yeah. And so it's a release valve for the Iranians, and they have been fairly assiduous in not causing mischief in that relationship with a Sunni neighbor. And that's rather striking when one thinks about it.
We have another question from the side. Yep. Second row. Yeah.
Yes, hi. My name is Nikki Kazimov. I'm a journalist. And I...
We gotta hear you.
It's on, just
speak up.
Yeah, my name is Nikki Kazimova. I'm a journalist, and I have a question about Nagorno-Karabakh conflict that has been mentioned a few times today here, as well as military buildup by by Russia on Armenian territory. The question is, with the latest news that Armenia refused to continue peace talks without security guarantees, how would you assess this situation? How would you comment? And how likely would Turkey to be involved militarily in case of serious hostilities?
I'll give a cynical answer to that, having spent many years, including as the OSCE coordinator, following every, and then ambassador to Turkey, following every slight change in the positions of one of the four actors, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Moscow, or Ankara, on that complex of issues. It has to be seen as part of Russia's expansion, even in the 1990s to some degree, Russia's view that the Caucasus is its backyard, Turkey's competing view of Azerbaijan as not only an important ethnic cousin and energy partner, but also Turkey's own interests there, colliding in a classic realpolitik way. So therefore, about 6 years ago, I gave up trying to follow the latest communique from the various capitals on what the preconditions are that always wind up in the end breaking down whatever ceasefire, whatever negotiating initiative by anyone. But someone might have a better answer for you.
I would just say that the recent uptick in fighting does not seem to have been calculated. The point of fact is you have troops close by each other for months and months, years and years, and sometimes the fighting happens. There's been no indication by anything that the Armenians have done or the Azeris have done that they're trying to take some new advantage. But Jim's exactly right that the problem in Nagorno-Karabakh is essentially a problem that Russia facilitated from the first days of its independence in 1991 as a way to have influence and pressure on Azerbaijan. And naturally, that's going to bring Turkey in on the side of Azerbaijan. But it's largely been within the limits.
If I could also interject, it's just you see that whenever this flares up, because Russia's in many ways, exerts control by maintaining instability on its borders. It's not just in the Caucasus, it's Ukraine. You can name different places around, right? And I always found it remarkable whenever there would be a flare-up, and granted this is the biggest flare-up that there's been since '94, how quickly either Putin himself or one of his very top deputies would be flying down to Sochi and pulling Armenia and Azerbaijan both into a room and being like, trying to put a lid on it instantaneously. I think that if he can't control it, and they've been trying to control it by making, discounted arms sales to Armenia, but also arms sales to Azerbaijan, trying to keep the parity of instability so that it keeps going. And he doesn't like it when it bursts past what he can control. So to the extent, the Russia's pulling the chain on that, it kind of runs counter to interest.
Another way of looking at it, though, is as long as it's controlled, it's not all bad from Putin's point of view that there's a little flare-up in Nagorno-Karabakh, especially if this is part of a let's keep Erdogan on his toes kind of philosophy right now. So bad things can happen all over your borders, and that's one of them. It's a little hard, given the relationship between the Armenian government and Moscow, to believe, however, that Armenian military activity is not fairly heavily influenced by Moscow. I mean, hard to believe they would act independent of Putin's imprimatur.
And beyond the flare-up, two important things happened in the Southern Caucasus API after the plane incident. One is that Russia deployed more troops to its two existing bases in Armenia. And second, Armenia folded its airspace under Russian airspace. Mm-hmm. So de facto, this makes Russia Turkey's military neighbor to the east, as well as being a neighbor to the south in Latakia and to the north in Crimea. So I think this is geostrategic play in coming in that Russia is trying to win, but win from a dominant position. And I think what it has really sparked is this deep sense of Russian fear among Turkish foreign policy elites. The Ottomans and the Russians fought 17 wars. Guess who started all of them? The Russians. And guess who lost all of them? The Turks. So Erdogan knows very clearly that he doesn't want an 18th war. And I think this not only pivots him to NATO and US, but it's also, in my view, Armenia, the Russian deployment to Armenia, whether Nagorno-Karabakh was part of that, is a broader Russian game of pinching Turkey from all sides.
Other questions? Yes, Lena.
Thank you. Alina Playakova, Atlantic Council. I want to go back to an earlier point that I think you made about EU accession, and then this is now the only choice for Turkey because it's opened the door through this refugee deal that the EU made with Turkey. But I actually wonder, and I want to push all of you on this point a little bit, the EU has been playing this game with Turkey for quite some time. About EU accession or not. And Turkey has been in this gray zone for the EU for a very long time. And I don't know if I see this as an opening or if it's just another false hope. And so this is the question. I mean, what do you think about that? Is it actually realistic to think that this is a true opening, or is it another sort of incremental step that helps the EU deal with this refugee problem in the short and medium term, but doesn't actually get Turkey anything else when it comes to further integration towards the EU?
So I guess the mere opening of new chapters, and no new chapters have been opened up for a while, but the opening of new chapters, and chapters that are parts of Turkey's accession talks process, there's 35 of them. Turkey has so far opened and closed only one. Many chapters are frozen because of objections by France and Greek Cypriots. So for a long time, talks were on deep freeze. Nothing was happening. There was no progress for at least half a decade. Now suddenly there's progress again. One more chapter is being opened up. Maybe others will be opened up, and there is movement going forward. So is this real, or is this a virtual movement? I think where it really becomes real is that the opening of chapters coincides with a changing of attitude among Turkish public towards EU accession. In the last decade, when Turkey opened accession talks with the EU, 2004 and 5, about 80% of Turkish public supported EU membership process. Then, as the AKP government pivoted to the Middle East to make Turkey a Middle East power, many Turks moved away from the idea of EU accession. Support for accession dropped from 80 to 60 to 40 to 20s by 2010. Only 23% of Turks were in favor of EU accession in 2010, the height of Turkey's newfound stardom in the Middle East. And that stardom was soon exposed to be false. As the Arab Spring started, Turkey discovered that it had really not built credible power in the Middle East, that it didn't have the hard power instruments to share the outcome of conflicts. And its adversaries in Iran and Russia were capable of undermining Turkey's policies. The government in Turkey, I don't think, has recalibrated and adjusted to this reality that Turkey's Middle East policy has been a giant failure. But the public has. Public opinion towards EU accession, which dipped at 20%, has started to go up since 2010, crossing 50% threshold for the first time last year. It's almost 60% this year. So this is the Turkish public subconsciously telling their government, this whole Middle East policy didn't work. We'd rather become a European country because this is exposing the country to major threats. Maybe the government will calibrate eventually, but I think the reason why this opening of chapters is not purely technical is because it coincides with a change of heart in the Turkish public. Of course, it also requires a change of heart in the European publics. That's the third part of the puzzle. When that happens, then it will be real momentum. Until that happens, I think it will be still virtual momentum.
The European attitude toward, the EU attitude toward Turkey accession reminds me of the prayer of St. Augustine of Hippo when he prayed, Lord, give me chastity, just not now. Give me a democratic, stable Turkey that can be a member of the European Union, just not now. And all right, we can't minimize the cultural significance and difficulty and challenge of all of that. But what is the alternative? And kind of, holding your fingers and wishing for the best is not a policy. And it seems to me our European allies have to deal with this. If we want to stabilize a volatile region with a strategic ally, we're going to have to put them on the path to accession if that's what their will.
I agree.
And it's in everyone's interest, it seems to me, that Turkey be aligned with Europe and the West, not the alternative.
I agree with the congressman, but now I'm going to disagree with him a little bit because
The St. Augustine thing?
Yeah. I could go on and on that. But anyway, this gives me a chance to go away from Turkey and Russia to hit on a always soft target, the EU. The problem with the EU is it's both a realpolitik project and it is a cultural, emotional identity project. What you just heard from the congressman is the classic realpolitik rationale for the EU as kind of a political economic version of NATO, bring in as many people as possible to solidify the Western worldview. It's why the United States is always, and I was one of the, and am one of the foremost advocates of it, knee-jerk, yes, closer relationships with Europe and Turkey. And the problem is that's only defined here as the EU process, because there's no other game in town. The only way you can really get closer to the EU is by being on a path to accession, because that's the way the whole thing works out. But then what kicks in is this whole cultural identity problem. There are problems on the Turkish side. There are problems on the European side, some of which are based upon biases and other things. But the biggest problem right now is what the Europeans see in Turkey, not just the authoritarian characteristics of President Erdogan, because they can write that off to it's just Erdogan, because they've seen plenty of others, Ecevit, Demirel, Özal, who didn't show that. But the fact that this guy got 50% of the vote and is the only political game in town, seemingly, is deeply troubling to Europeans who are already deeply troubled by what's happening in their backyards in Poland and Hungary, for example. So I think this is a really, really big problem because we don't fix that disconnect between the realpolitik and the identity side of the EU.
I agree with the ambassador, and I think the cultural and historical problems are monumental. But my bottom line, though, I don't know if it's realpolitik or Augustinian theology, but what's your alternative?
Yeah, that's
you got a better plan? Because I don't think there is a viable alternative long term. So let's work this out. And the U.S. can be a useful prod.
The cultural element's important, but if Turkey were to take a strong step, a stable step in the direction of democracy and open society, which would include, this is heresy in certain quarters, a more open understanding of the whole issue of Armenia. I think that those cultural barriers would melt very quickly.
Other questions? Yes. There's a mic right at minute zero.
My name is Ahmad Hashemi. I'm a defected Iranian Foreign Ministry employee. I came here 5 months ago as a refugee. So I have a question from Mr. Congressman. As you rightly mentioned that YPG, YPG, is the only effective force in the Syria fighting ISIS. It's okay. I mean, nobody doubt that. But it becomes problematic when it tries to annex other territories, other lands, which are predominantly Turkmen and Arabic, like Tel Abyad, and to create a unified Kurdish land. What's your stance on that? And also, I mean, American, because the Amnesty International and the Human Rights Watch, they objected this policy of, even there was allegations of ethnic cleansing in Tel Abyad and other parts, and some rural areas.
Your question for the congressman is what's his stance on a greater Kurdistan? Okay, I just want to see if there's any other questions because we're getting very close to not having much more time.
Thank you.
Okay, if you want to answer.
Well, look, I think in this particular case, probably you could characterize what I said as an opportunistic, pragmatic view of U.S. policy on the ground at this time. We're looking for allies in the fight against ISIS. We see ISIS as a threat to our values and a source of terrorism that clearly can operate in the West. That is antithetical to our interests and to our well-being. So who do we find as allies right now? And the YPG is one of them. That doesn't mean we favor a greater Kurdistan. It doesn't mean we favor, hegemony by anybody, including YPG, if they have those goals and aspirations. We're looking pragmatically for partners on the ground with whom we can fight and take the fight to ISIS. And in Syria particularly, we have damn few allies to look at who are reliable. And so that's what I meant. I wouldn't read anything broader into the relationship. Now, the Peshmerga in Iraq, that's a different matter. That's a longer-term relationship, I think. And yeah, there may be also some concerns about human rights. On the other hand, there have been instances where the Kurds have provided protection to other groups. The Yazidis come to mind, that nobody else protected. So it's a complex relationship, but it's one born out of, right now, really a pragmatic desire to find somebody willing to fight who shows the ability to succeed on the battlefield.
In the 2 minutes we have left, I just want to ask one question we've been focusing so much on politics and geopolitics and emotional pulls back and forth. This is far less dramatic, but I want to ask a question about money. Because when the Turkish-Russian relationship is good, it's been based on trade, it's been based on travel, it's been based on things that have made these countries' economies improve, maybe not to a great extent, but I'm wondering, if things stay broken down, how much can they hurt each other and how much can they hurt themselves, just financially? Because you can't pay for your wars and your campaigns if you can't keep your economy going. And granted, they've got other ties to other parts of the world. But I'm just wondering, on that issue, since that is the place that they have come together in the past, what could happen?
Very quickly, first of all, the military side of this, unless they get in a real war, which they won't, this is beyond the decimal point. Okay, an F-16 missile here, a few bombs there. In terms of the economic relationship between them, the Russians took the most dramatic step by cutting tourism. That was billions of dollars. But the gas trade, even if Putin wants to change it, he's got two problems. One is it's a pipeline-based system, and for many reasons that the Atlantic Council is great at, you can't just shift around. Secondly, he would lose tremendous, including in the Nord Stream issue that's very much on the agenda right now, he would lose tremendous credibility and reliability if he cut, for whatever reason, a major gas deal. And this is very major for him. And in terms of those two nuclear plants, hey, if the Russians, step out of that thing, the Turks will find somebody who didn't build Chernobyl to give them help with the energy sector. Okay.
Yeah. I see what's going on as within a contained context. Putin, it's not in Russia's interest and it's not in Putin's interest for it to get out of hand. Mischief within that contained context, all for the good, especially if it kind of embarrasses Erdogan. All the better. But a protracted conflict is not something desirable from Russia's point of view or Turkey's, and will have further economic consequences. Putin maintains his popularity apparently, but the economic situation in Russia is getting quite serious, and Western sanctions have hurt, and of course the plummeting price of energy is catastrophic, so he's got to perforce limit just how much he engages in extracurricular activity, if you will.
The danger of a Russian strike at Turkey in some form was much higher in December and January than it is today. And in fact, I think the Russians were trying to sucker the Turks into a confrontation when they sent their plane into Turkish airspace in January. They put their most advanced missiles right up along the border in northern Syria, and the Turks realized the game, and they did nothing. So that I think is diminished, that danger. The economic warfare continues, and while it was a quote-unquote Russian blow at Turkey, in fact, there's been blowback in Russia because that was the favorite spot for millions of Russians to go vacation. And that's contributing to his domestic woes. Meanwhile, the Turks are now considering taking it. It's not the Russians canceling the power plant. It's more the Turks may cancel the Russian part of that power plant, the nuclear power plant. So there's the problem between Russia and Turkey is diminishing, but the economic problem remains.
I would add that on the military side, on the balance sheet, I think Russia has the upper hand, though as the rest of the panel, I rule out military conflict. I think primarily because Turkey is in NATO. That's not something Russia will venture into. But on the economic side, on the trade side, Turkey actually on the balance sheet has the upper hand. Turkey has many other markets that it can sell to if Russians decide not to buy Turkish goods. Turkish businesses are incredibly versatile. I did a piece of research at the Washington Institute a couple of years ago looking at how the Syrian war was impacting trade in Turkish provinces along the border. There's a province called Gaziantep, so it lost its trade with Syria when the war started. You know, after they lost their trade with Syria, to which country they started exporting? Afghanistan. So if they can switch from Syria to Afghanistan, they can definitely switch from Russia to somebody else. So I think Turkey definitely has the upper hand. It has a very dynamic, vibrant economic structure, and it will be able to withstand any kind of trade wars. And that's why I think Putin has launched a full-scale trade war, knowing that Russia will be the loser. Sanctions have also hurt because Russia is already unable to buy stuff from most advanced society, industrial society, so that leaves Turkey as a rare market from where it can get goods, and it can go as basic as tomatoes. There are only so many countries from which you can buy good tomatoes, and Turkish tomatoes are good. So.
And with that, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to all of you for coming and staying and engaging in the discussion. And I'm sure that people will be milling around for a few minutes afterwards if you have anything additional, but thanks so much, and that wraps up our panel.